It is Monday, December 11th, 2017, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft. That's right, you heard me correctly. The name of this show is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, not Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, where myself, Kenneth Arthur, talks to a comedian about their favorite NFL team. Not Seahawks Chats with Kenneth Arthur, where I bring in someone to talk about the Seahawks exclusively, about the Seattle Seahawks. That happens mostly once a week too. And it's not the instant reaction podcast with Kenneth Arthur where I, talk about the game prior to the game itself, or after the game, excuse me, which you can hear on this very network. As I posted last night, my reactions to the Seahawks 30-24 loss to the Jacksonville Jaguars. No, it's none of those shows at all. It's another show called 3000 NFL Mock Draft with myself, Kenneth Arthur, and co-host / expert Rob Staten of BBC, of Seahawks Draft Blog.com, our boy across the pond. That's the show that you're listening to, the one that ran for at least a couple years every single week, and has taken a bit of a hiatus, I guess you could say, as I try and manage those other 2 to 3 podcasts. But we can come back now, and after the Seattle's difficult loss to the Jaguars, myself and Rob, we can maybe focus on what's going on next year, at a perfect time as the Seahawks, not just because of where they're at, but also Rob just happened to post a 2018 first round mock this past week on SeahawksDraftBlog.com, or a projection, if you will. So we have something to talk about with next year's draft, content with which to draw. We'll talk about how these players may fit into the Seahawks plans. We'll talk about how these players may fit into the hands of our Seahawks foes like the 49ers, the Rams, and the Arizona Cardinals. So it's still going to be a Seahawks-centric talk for the most part in many areas, as well as Washington prospects like Vita Vea. We'll be able to talk about some of the Washington State guys. There's plenty of stuff to go on within the state of Washington as far as football is concerned, so don't worry too much about that. And yes, we'll talk about the Seahawks briefly and their game next week against the LA Rams for first place in the NFC West. But first, we get into the 2018 NFL Draft. Rob, you've constructed your first look ahead in terms of potential, draft order, and then also, putting the picks together and trying to connect the dots on some of these teams and the needs and what players will be available in next year's draft. And Rob, before we get into the specifics, when you look at next year's draft for the whole first class and how all of the classes, in terms of the position breakdowns and stuff, when you look ahead to that, as far as the first round is concerned, what's going to go early and then be completely barren? Which positions, sort of like we see oftentimes with offensive line, like we saw last year, that if you didn't get maybe a Garrett Bowles, if you weren't drafting in the top 20, you might be reaching. And I think that's maybe one area to go in. At the draft order as it is now is Browns at 1, Giants at 2, Colts at 3, 49ers at 4, Broncos at 5, the Browns at 6 again in their pick that they got from the Texans, followed by the Bears, Bucks, Jets, and Bengals. So that's some of the idea of what teams will be picking in the top 10, including the Browns twice. What positions are going to go early, and if you don't get them in the top 15, 20, you're going to be picking on the second, third tier pretty quickly.
Like most years, Kenny, it's going to end up being the offensive line. We're going to see quite just a handful of offensive linemen going quite early. There are some good ones that are almost certain to go quite early. For example, Quentin Nelson at Notre Dame might be second or third best player in the entire draft. I would expect that he's going to go in the top 12 kind of range there. We will see the offensive tackles go off the board very quickly because there just aren't that many to be had there. There are very few prospects that you would see as left tackle prospects. For example, someone like Connor Williams at Texas might be somebody that you think about trying at left tackle, but then you've got Mike McGlinchey, who's probably more of a right tackle at the next level, and not a great deal else. So if you want to tackle in this draft class, you've got to get one early, and then there really is not many options there. And I think the other offensive lineman that will go early is Billy Price, the Ohio State center, who's really, really good. He's just sort of a slight notch behind Quentin Nelson himself. Price could easily be a top 10 prospect in this draft class. It probably won't go that early, but teams are going to really, really like this guy. Urban Meyer's been raving about him. Meyer, of course, coached the two Pouncey twins, so he knows about sort of quality interior line play that going into the league and the impact it can have. So I would think that offensive line, as usual, is going to be the position that goes early and then is barren because, as we've discussed many, many times, there just aren't that many good offensive linemen in the college football at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds like something that's continuing. And before we even, and one other thing to get into before we talk about some of these actual players, is there anything going on as we approach bowl season and the college football playoff? Is there any game? Is there any matchup? Is there any guy out there that you're like, I need to see how he does in this game. I need to see how he does against Alabama. I need to see how he does against Clemson. I want to see how this guy performs when there's nothing left to play for. Is there any players out there right now that are going into their final bowl games that you think these are going to have the most impact on that player? Games for maybe also for people to watch out for in that regard?
Well, the bowl games, unfortunately, have really regressed over the last couple of years because of stuff that happened, like to Jalen Smith, for example, with the injury that he had, and then it really impacted his stock. And we're seeing a number of players already saying that they're going to turn pro and not play in their bowl games. People like Derwin James are not going to play in their bowl game, for example. So I think this is going to become a common occurrence that any player that is going to go and turn pro is going to have to give it a serious consideration whether they want to play. That will not happen in the playoffs, of course. So the 4 teams that have got into the playoffs, we would expect to see their best players performing whether they're going to the league or not, because there's still something tangible to play for there, unlike in many of the bowl games. Some of the more high-profile bowl games, of course, we'll still see some big-name players there. But I think what I'm looking forward to the most is just seeing, like, for example, how someone like Baker Mayfield, who won the Heisman Trophy, how he can maybe propel his stock as well. And just put a cherry on the top of what he's done this season at Oklahoma, and whether he can put on another big performance. We've already seen him go to Ohio State on the road, have a great win there. Can he have a really good playoff campaign, for example? There are so many players that I've got in a mock draft that have actually got through to the playoffs, and you want to sort of see them, how they're going to compete. And I just think that you look at how the players perform against Alabama is always a good test. How are players, if you're coming up against Clemson's defensive line and all the talent they have up front, how you're going to deal with that? I think they're the kind of things that I'm going to be looking out for. I must admit that I'm really, really pleased that Alabama got through and not Ohio State into the playoffs. I think they've got the best 4 teams to the playoffs, the most entertaining 4. The bowl games are not complete. There's not one sort of bowl game. Maybe the Washington game stands out a little bit there, just for a little bit of intrigue. But there weren't many bowl games that stood out to me. But I thought the playoffs really jumped off the page, and it's a great 4. And it'll be really good to sort of watch so much NFL talent in those 4 teams and see how they're going to compete.
So getting into your projection, top 25 projection for next year, you've got 3 of the top 4 guys on this list as quarterbacks, but you also note that Sam Darnold, the quarterback at USC, that there's enough idea that he'll be staying at USC as to not project him in next year's first round yet. With that being said, if Sam Darnold was a part of this quarterback class, how would that shift around the order of these guys? And how many, how would you classify this quarterback draft class? Because sometimes we do see years where guys go number 1, number 2, like Carson Wentz and Jared Goff, and we've seen that 2 years later, basically a year later, that they have both developed quite a bit and taken huge strides towards becoming, regular NFL starters, if not stars. Meanwhile, we also have seen the years where maybe, and you could still classify Goff and Wentz like this, but maybe years where it feels more forced, and teams are taking quarterbacks 1, 2 because it's the most important position in the game by a long shot, and also because it's so hard to find that getting your franchise guy, maybe you do, reach for one early on, and you see that happen with, maybe if you wanted to say that people, if a guy goes 2-3, it doesn't mean he's bad. But if there's no quarterback number one, it means that there's clearly some sort of red flag, red card with this person. How good do you see this class, and where would Sam Darnold, how much would he move the needle? Where would he fit in?
Well, Darnold would be competing with Josh Rosen to be the first overall pick, and it would be down to teams to meet the two players. They're very different. So the things that you like about Darnold are his improvisation, his ability to get out of the pocket and keep his eyes downfield and make plays that are a little bit more improbable, maybe. Rosen's more of a guy that you would imagine you put him in a system and that he will make things tick. You know, you want the ball to be delivered at this place at this time, and he's going to do that for you. You know, maybe Darnold's more of the classic style quarterback. Rosen's more of the classic style. Darnold's more of that creative type. So I would think that they would be competing to essentially be the 1 and 2 picks in the draft. If it was, for example, Cleveland and the Giants, who were the first 2 picks, you would imagine that Rosen and Darnold would be the top 2. But it's to sort of make a judgment on who's better. I mean, I like them both. I think they've both had really good years, really strong years. You know, maybe Darnold hasn't quite hit the heights that everybody was expecting from him, but it was his first year as a starter. But I like them both. And I think you just sort of sit down in a room and you make a decision on who you think's best to lead your club. And some will go with Darnold and some will go with Rosen. As for the quarterback class in general, I kind of find it another healthy reminder of what actually happens pretty much every year. It's not happened this year so far, but it will do if people like Darnold return to USC. And that is, there is this kind of feeling, or you will hear it reported in the media, or draft pundits, or even draft Twitter, or whatever you follow, will say next year's quarterback class is always better. And they were saying that last year. And if you remember last year, Kenny, we spent the start of the year talking a lot about Deshaun Watson. And, you know, I really liked Deshaun Watson and didn't really understand why people were knocking him and what he was capable of doing. Especially when everybody raves so much about Jared Goff the year before. And for me, Watson was the better player, had achieved more in college. And I think when he got to the NFL and got his chance at Houston before the injury, we saw what, you know, there's the feeling behind that. And that there always seems to be this sentiment that next year's quarterback class is better. And I think when you look back at last year and you look at the likes of Watson, I think Trubisky's playing quite well in his first year in Chicago, and I liked him, and we'll see what Patrick Mahomes has got about him down the road as well. And I didn't think last year's quarterback class was as bad as everybody made out. And when you look at this one, I think Rosen, Darnold, I really like Baker Mayfield, and I just love the way that he's played out. I would love to see what he's going to do at the next level, and will not be scared off by any of the supposed character things. I just think he's a really competitive guy. I think when you look at those three and Lamar Jackson as well, it's a decent group, and some teams will convince themselves that there are guys in this first round worth taking a shot on.
So let's talk about some of the teams specifically, and none more interesting or intriguing than the Cleveland Browns. Not just because of, you know, the Browns rebuilding project that's gone on for 18 years is fascinating in itself. And there's that aspect to it, not only because they'll almost certainly 99% be the number 1 overall pick this year. They've won 1 game in the last 2 years. They've got some really great young pieces to build around, and Josh Gordon is back. So when you look at that number 1 pick for the Browns, and when you see, if you see DeShone Kizer play well in the final month of the season, especially because of the way that Josh Gordon is back, and we saw in his game against the Packers, DeShone Kizer, you know, was very good for the start of the game. Clearly, Gordon is having a significant impact on him and that offense. And if you can picture Gordon and Corey Coleman and coming back next year with having Joe Thomas's return and all these kinds of things, can you see the Cleveland Browns getting away from drafting a quarterback? Or with this class and with them having 2 picks and with all the opportunities for the Cleveland right now, do you see any way that it's not the Cleveland Browns selecting a quarterback number 1 overall?
No, I think they have to take a quarterback, and you know, the worst case scenario if they do take a quarterback is that they then have Kizer and, for example, Josh Rosen competing for the job, which is not a bad thing. You know, it's better to have 2 quarterbacks that you like than none. And you know, taking the quarterback with the first pick there, and you let them compete and see who's the winner. And if both quarterbacks play well, eventually down the road you can trade one of them and get some value back. So I think that's what they have to do. They cannot afford. Let's imagine this other scenario. If they passed, for example, on Rosen, Darnold, Mayfield, whoever ends up being the number 1 overall pick, or the first quarterback off the board, rather. Imagine if they passed on them, and then the exact same thing happens with that quarterback that happened with Carson Wentz, which is that player then goes on and has, a really good start to his career and gets in the MVP race and leads his team to 10, 11 wins. And the Browns there and Deshaun Kaiser's got them at 0 wins again, or 1 win or 2 wins. I mean, this is a franchise that just completely drops the ball consistently. The regime changes, they never get it right. They have to take a quarterback with this first pick, and they have to decide of those available who it's going to be. There are options there that are legitimate first overall picks. I think Rosen, if he declares, is somebody that you can take a chance on and build around and develop and bring in. And I think that would be a very wise choice if Darnold doesn't declare, that Rosen would be the number 1 overall pick. And I can I could sit here and say, well, maybe they should take Saquon Barkley instead. And then, at the moment, I think they'd be picking the new draft order. The mock draft I did was last week, and the draft order's changed a little bit with Houston losing to San Francisco this weekend. Or last weekend. They actually, at the moment, own the 1st overall pick and the 5th overall pick. So Cleveland at the moment are going to be picking twice in the top 5. So you could say, well, why don't they take Barkley with the 1st pick and then someone like Baker Mayfield, for example, with the 5th pick? That wouldn't be an atrocious plan if it came off. If no one traded up and stole the quarterback from them, that's the risk that they would be taking in that situation. If they have the 1st and the 5th overall pick, maybe they find a way between now and April to trade with a team who's number 2 overall and have the first 2 picks. And then maybe they do take Barkley first and the quarterback second, whatever. One way or another, though, they have to come out with a quarterback from the first round. And I suspect that it will be with the first pick.
And with the Browns having that 2nd pick as well from the Texans, which right now is slated to be 6th, and so it's probably going to definitely be in the top 10. They have options there to go. And I just want to also talk about Hugh Jackson, because it sounds like, that they've committed to Hugh Jackson for 2018. They fired Sashi Brown and said, we're going to bring back Hugh Jackson. We believe Sashi Brown is the guy that's the problem here. But Hugh Jackson is 1-28 now as coach of the Cleveland Browns. It's an insane record. It's insane. I mean, the last quarterback to win a game for the Browns was Robert Griffin III, and the one before that was Johnny Manziel. And that's crazy. And the second most recent win in Cleveland has come from Johnny Manziel. So they've won 1 game under Hugh Brown. And I hear, a lot of people support Hugh Jackson and call Hugh Jackson, this offensive genius who just hasn't been, given anything with the Cleveland Browns. Well, first of all, I mean, they've had Joe Thomas, for most of this run. They went out and they got, their center. They spent money there. They got Kevin Zeitler. Their offensive line, we went into the season saying could be the best in the NFL, one of the best for sure. We've seen talent out of Isaiah Crowell and Duke Johnson. We've seen, talent out of, some of these other guys that are playing on offense, though they're not having spectacular seasons. So that's also an issue, I think, for the fact of calling Jackson a genius for having a decent year with the Cincinnati Bengals in 2015. And then defensively, having Myles Garrett, and there's some stuff there. And you can make that excuse, I think, that Hugh Jackson is doing the best he can with what he has if the Browns were 3-10. But they have won no games. They've won 1 game in the last 2 years. Very well could go 0-16. They have to go to they have to host the Ravens, and they have to go to Chicago and Pittsburgh. So very much looking at an 0-16 season. Do you think Hugh Jackson is a good coach? Do you think that you would trust Hugh Jackson with these 2 top 6, top 10 picks?
Well, I think that some coaches in the National Football League seem to get a good press, a good publicity, and seem to curry favour a lot more than others. So, for example, you'll never really hear anybody say anything positive about Darrell Bevell or Tom Cable, really. At least, follow the Seahawks. But I imagine if you offered the kind of people who would complain about Bevell, for example, the opportunity to have Hugh Jackson as the offensive coordinator in Seattle next year, they'd probably say, yeah, give it a shot. Sounds like a good idea. But he really has not had a good time in Cleveland. And, sometimes I think it's difficult to judge coordinators on their suitability to be head coaches. Really, I think being a great head coach is about commanding respect, which is some people have it, some people don't. It's about being able to establish a culture within an organization and within a building, whether you're working with a small group of people or a huge army of people like you do if you're the head coach of a football team. It's not the easiest thing to do, and when you see the likes of Pete Carroll and Bill Belichick, and in the past, people like Tom Coughlin, for example, they have this way of creating a culture, and we're seeing that in Jacksonville right now. I mean, Coughlin's there is one of these, an executive, isn't he, in Jacksonville, and you can kind of see his fingerprints all over that Jaguars setup now, and the way that they're playing and their style and everything to do with that. And some coaches go in and they just don't have that ability to shift the culture. And Hugh Jackson might be a very, very, very good offensive coordinator when his responsibility is to set up a game plan and call plays on a Sunday. He may not be the best at sort of managing several group of coaches, having input on how he wants his defense to play, managing personnel across the board, making decisions on who they want to bring in, who they want to draft, who they want to sign, who's going to go, who's going to stay, stuff like that. So he might not be particularly good at that job. So I don't know. It's quite difficult to judge someone like Hugh Jackson as a coach, but in terms of the job he's done in Cleveland, it's very easy to judge it. He just has not been anywhere close to being good enough.
So you've got the Cleveland Browns taking Josh Rosen, number one. Number two, you got the New York Giants taking Josh Allen. And you talk about how Allen has been heavily criticized this year and is probably one of the most divisive, if not the most divisive prospect in this draft. Do you have Allen as maybe the most variance on his draft stock between now and April? Do you think he's the one that could go anywhere from number one to falling out of the first round, or how do you feel about Allen right now and his fit maybe with a team like the Giants?
Well, I've only seen him in games, and I don't really like what I've seen at all. I mean, I think you can definitely see that he's got some physical skill there. He's very, very big. He's got a strong arm, but he's very mobile as well. Can extend plays, can throw the ball from many different angles, and can make these incredible throws downfield. You look at him and you say, okay, there is something you can work with there in terms of physicality, but then you also watch the games and you just see mistakes, bad reads, forcing throws, not seeing linebackers across the middle. I like to look at quarterbacks and see them elevate their team and, overachieve if they can while they're in college, because that's what you're going to need them to do at the next level. And, to see him at Wyoming, and yes, the argument is that the supporting cast at Wyoming has been terrible, but to see him toil the way that he has and not really lift that team this year is a little bit concerning to me. And I think he's probably more of a project than anything. But I was reading a piece, I can't remember who wrote it. Was it Charles Robinson? Is that the guy's name? At Yahoo Sports. And he was saying that when they were at the Manning Passing Academy, that people were looking at Josh Allen, that teams were looking at Josh Allen and were raving about, I can work with that and I can do this. And there seems to be a lot of feel. There was a lot of feel about him a year ago that if he declared that he could go in the first round and go quite early, and then at the end of the season that he was going to be a very, very early pick. So despite what I personally wouldn't draft him. I mean, I would not take him with the number 2 overall pick. I would take Baker Mayfield instead. But the point of the mock is that this isn't really what I think should happen. It's what I think could essentially happen. And I could imagine a team drafting Allen with the idea of sitting him for a little while, seeing how he develops, working on him, and maybe midway through that first year, giving him the chance to start, or redshirt him for a year, having brought in a more experienced quarterback. And the Giants in that regard might not be the best team for him. Maybe the Jets would be a better team if they bring McCown back, for example, who's had a pretty good year, and then have Allen sit for a season and sort of watch how things work, learn the playbook, adapt a little bit, and sort of take the pressure off him a little bit. That might be the best thing for someone like him. But I'm not a huge Josh Allen fan. I just get the sense that there's been enough noise about him going early that you kind of have to think, where there's smoke, there's fire there.
Moving on to pick number 3 now, and when you did this, it was prior to Sunday's game, so you had the 49ers picking 3rd overall. I'm seeing now that maybe the Indianapolis Colts have moved into that number 3 position because of their loss in that ridiculous snow game to the Buffalo Bills. So with that being said, you've got Saquon Barkley going number 3 to San Francisco, calling him the best player eligible for the 2018 draft. Excuse me. But the Indianapolis Colts at number 3, moving ahead of the San Francisco 49ers. Number 1, the Colts, are playing this season without Andrew Luck, and we don't know what the status of his career is. But I think most people would assume by that time, he should be healthy again. And I'm sure that's going to be every effort made to have Andrew Luck ready for the start of next season. So with that being said, though, Indianapolis Colts at number 3. I actually have to give Chuck Pagano a slight bit of credit, a guy that I think has been heading towards the road to be fired for years now and has survived over and over again, unbeknownst to me why I wouldn't do it. But this year, with the loss of Andrew Luck, Malik Hooker tearing his ACL and his MCL, a very tough season. They're only 3-10, but they've played admirably, and they've had close losses, and I give them some credit there. But with that being said, next year, the Indianapolis Colts, do you see them taking Saquon Barkley if they were at number 3? Do you see them having any consideration for a quarterback? And would you say that you would fire or keep Chuck Pagano?
Oh, I think that, a change has been probably long overdue there. I think they do need a bit of a restart in Indianapolis, and there's been some really good offensive coaches going into jobs. The Shanahan McVay types last year have gone on and I think are showing some positive signs there. And if there is that kind of an offensive mind they can bring in, because you would hope for their sake that Andrew Luck is going to come back next year, that this isn't going to be his career over, and when he does come back, he's going to need all the help he can get. So I would think there may be a change there. As for Saquon Barkley going to Indianapolis, well, possibly. He could go anywhere. He's such a good player that if he went with the first overall pick, second, third, fourth, fifth, I could imagine a team with a desperate need at running back taking him. I can imagine a team that just loves the heck out of Saquon Barkley taking him. He's such a good player, such a good character. He's going to provide instant credibility and leadership within the locker room. So I could see him really going anywhere. But when you look at the Colts, they've just got so many needs. They've got defensive needs across the board, really. Cornerback, defensive line, linebacker. On the offensive line, they've got major needs. And you're talking there about whether or not they would consider a quarterback. I guess so if they could convince somebody to trade for Luck, which would seem unlikely at this stage given the injuries he's had. I would imagine someone like Saquon Barkley or taking one of the better defensive linemen in this class. And there's quite a handful of decent defensive linemen who will go early. I think that would be the most likely bet for them at this stage.
Number 4 now is the San Francisco 49ers. And what are your initial thoughts now that Jimmy Garoppolo's been out there a little bit? Obviously, they really have no choice but to stick with Garoppolo and give him at least a franchise tag. And, I think yesterday the 49ers pull out the win, which improves their record to 3-10, which is what drops them. They've now won 2 in a row and 3 of their last 4. Their only loss coming against the Seahawks, and 2 of those wins coming on the road. So what did you see from Jimmy Garoppolo, and where do you see the 49ers going here with this position? In fact, do you see them maybe winning some games and falling even further down the draft?
Well, that's the good thing, really. If the more that they win this year, the harder it's going to be for them to sort of. The last thing I kind of want to see in the NFC West is the Seahawks continue to struggle at the running back position, and they're three of the teams in the division have got David Johnson, Todd Gurley, and Saquon Barkley. So that's not a very. It's almost like they're taking the piss a little bit out of you. The fact that you don't have the running back and they have 3 sensational ones. So didn't really want to see him in San Francisco. So if they keep winning, they'll move away from that. I like what they've done there. I like the way Garoppolo's playing. Saw a fair bit of the Houston game yesterday and liked what he was doing. Like the fact that Pierre Garçon, I think Pierre Garçon was a really good signing for them. I know he's injured at the moment, but provided a really good option out wide. And I think if he comes back next year, would be a vital weapon for them. Kittle has provided them with a tight end that they can believe in for some time now. They've got young defensive line, and I think that they've done a decent job of acquiring talent in a short space of time, and now the pressure is going to be on them to keep doing that. The problem that they're going to have is that they've got a quarterback, so they're not going to be looking there. And defensive line is pretty much one of their strengths, so you would imagine they're not going to be looking there either. So what positions would they consider? Would they look at someone like Minkah Fitzpatrick, for example, to add something to the secondary? Possibly. Would they look to build towards the offensive line? That's a possibility. Would they even consider pairing their first round linebacker last year with Roquan Smith, the Georgia linebacker. You know, that would be a fearsome duo at linebacker to have there. So I think if they keep winning, maybe the likelihood for San Francisco would be that they would trade down and try and recoup picks, because of course they spent that second rounder on Garoppolo to get him.
We move into the Denver Broncos at 5, and the Denver Broncos had an interesting situation in that they had to. We talked about the Hugh Jackson decision. We talked about Chuck Pagano. We've talked about other coaches staying in, and Vance Joseph takes over a Denver Broncos team that had been very successful, winning the Super Bowl in 2015. Obviously, falling to 9-7 in 2016, but still a respectable team that had started 8-4 last year. And this team, started 3-1 and was atop many power rankings. And they have since lost every game up until yesterday when they beat the New York Jets 23-0. So Vance Joseph, is that performance by the quarterbacks, which is a passer rating of 71.1. They have nothing in Trevor Siemian, nothing in Brock Osweiler, and seemingly nothing in Paxton Lynch. We talked about Paxton Lynch a lot in the last 2 years ago when it was Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, and then how much we liked some of the attributes of Paxton Lynch. What's the status now on Paxton Lynch for you? Like, does he have even a future as a backup in the NFL? And where do you see the Denver Broncos as a pretty easy fit for Baker Mayfield?
Yeah, well, I think John Elway is the kind of GM who would take a chance on Mayfield. When I think about the Broncos, Paxton Lynch didn't win the job last year as a rookie, and then has been injured this year, and it's really sort of prevented him from showing what he can do. So he's not had a chance to develop, not had a chance to really get a run of games going, and it's got to the point now where the Broncos. I've had him for 2 years, and they have to do something. Whether they bring in a quarterback and then let them compete with Lynch and then see how it goes, I don't know. But they can't really afford to go into next year with Lynch and Simeon just competing the way that they have this year, because it's been a total mess. And it's been difficult for Vance Joseph because on the one hand they have been such a shambles. The Broncos, they've just been so bad that you want to say, well, the coach is out of his depth. He's rookie head coach, had only had one season even as a defensive coordinator before getting a head coach job, that maybe he's just not up to the task. And then you look at the situation at quarterback and you look at some of the issues that they've had on offense. It's very hard to win games in the NFL with that setup in Denver. So maybe if he can have a couple more wins like he had yesterday, he will cling on to his job. There's been a lot of speculation that he was going to be a one-and-done coach. If he can hold on to the off-season, I think that there's been a report saying that John Elway really likes Vance Joseph and doesn't really want to have to make that move. But he needs to see some encouraging signs. That was one yesterday, the blowout of the Jets. But I think that the Broncos need some excitement on offense. They need somebody to believe in that can get them back into contention. They have got a good defense. They have got people like Von Miller. And I think if they could get Baker Mayfield with their first pick, that would be exactly the kind of move that will get people in Denver excited again.
So if we had with the updated draft order, it could go Browns, Josh Rosen, Giants, Josh Allen, Colts, Saquon Barkley, and then the Denver Broncos, San Francisco 49ers at 4. Who would you project the 49ers at 4? What was that one again?
Well, I think they could potentially take someone like Fitzpatrick, for example, the defensive back at Alabama. Or I think in that situation they probably trade down and maybe they do something with Denver to make sure that, because Denver would be looking behind over the shoulder a little bit there and saying, is someone like Washington going to move up maybe for Mayfield if they've lost Kirk Cousins? Would the Jets look to move up? Would Arizona, have to be a dark horse to move into the top 10 and go and get a quarterback if Carson Palmer, even if Carson Palmer doesn't retire, you'd expect them to go and do that. So I think that maybe sort of a trade between Denver and San Francisco in this situation would be favorable, and then maybe San Francisco would move down again from number 5 if there was anybody else wanting to move above Cleveland for whatever reason at number 6.
So if you were the Cleveland Browns there next with the Houston Texans pick, some of the guys on the board might be an all defensive at this point now, where we're looking at this for Cleveland in the sense of a Bradley Chubb, Vita Vea, Minka Fitzpatrick. Those are some of the guys that were available there from that 5 to 7 in your mock draft, and if they were all available for the Browns, What would you see as the most helpful? I mean, if you were looking at a defensive lineman and you could put him there next to Myles Garrett next year, would that be the most appealing thing to you, or would you stick with the Minkah Fitzpatrick?
Well, they could bookend him with Bradley Chubb, which would be a really, really dynamic duo of pass rushers, and you can definitely see some benefit to having that. But, they did draft Emmanuel Ogbah, and do they need that type of player to do that kind of role? Could they learn maybe a bit from the Jacksonville Jaguars and see that pumping resources, and they've got a fair bit of spare cap room in Cleveland, if they could pump some resource into big-name veteran defensive linemen, throw money in that range, then that would free them up to look at other areas and draft young defensive backs, which is what Jacksonville did with Jalen Ramsey. I think Fitzpatrick would be a decent fit there, sort of quiet, reserved, but leads by example, makes plays, gets around the field. I think that he would be the kind of player that they need. And, they already at this point would have had the quarterback. They've got an offensive line. They've got weapons at receiver. So that would, I imagine, be the kind of thing they're looking at there.
The Chicago Bears hired John Fox in 2015, taking over for Mark Trestman, who had gone 5-11. And in 2015, John Fox improved them by just one game to 6-10. Then last year they fell to 3-13. This year they're 4-9. So there's definitely, talk out there, heavy talk out there that John Fox will be fired. I don't know how he gets another job after this, but we'll see. But in terms of the Bears and their needs, do you like one of the guys that I feel is somehow flown under the radar the entire season practically is Mitchell Trubisky? His numbers this year through 9 games is a 3-6 record, 58% completion, 6 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 6.7 yards per attempt, and passer rating of 80. Certainly, we've seen much worse performances by rookies. That's pretty decent. We get a little spoiled with some of these guys, but for the most part, those numbers seem pretty decent for a rookie, especially one on an offense where I don't think the average person could name a single offensive weapon outside of Jordan Howard, maybe. I mean, not the average person, because the average person doesn't give a shit, but the average football fan maybe couldn't name any of the skill players outside of Jordan Howard. So how do you like Mitchell Trubisky and the Bears moving forward with or without John Fox?
Yeah, I like Trubisky. I like what he's done this year. Liked him in the draft and liked him at North Carolina, and think that he's somebody that can build with. I kind of have enjoyed watching the Bears this year. I've got a friend who follows the Bears, and quite often we talk about how they're getting on and what they need. And I was speaking to him last week, and he said that receivers a big need, obviously, but I think this would be a bit too early to take one. There's been some speculation that the Bears really like Calvin Ridley at Alabama. I personally would think this would be way too early to take Calvin Ridley. I just don't think he does enough. He's not like Odell Beckham or anybody like that. You get to take a receiver in the top 10. You want them to have the size of Julio Jones or Mike Evans and the athleticism to match, or you just want them to be really, really dynamic. And whenever I watch Calvin Ridley, I kind of think he's just kind of solid. He's just a solid player who does his best to get open, but I can't imagine him being a great tester. So if they did want someone like Calvin Ridley, move down a bit and try and get him a little later on. The other need that was discussed was defensive line, and they don't have the worst defensive line in the world, but there's a feeling that they could just have a bit more to help them there. That there are players in the secondary that have turned up for the Bears this year. They've got the quarterback now, so maybe another defensive lineman, and that would work to some of the options available here. You're looking at someone like Bradley Chubb, Vita Vea, Christian Wilkins. There are really good players that in this kind of range the Bears might consider if they end up picking this early.
If we're talking about maybe most disappointing teams and coaches that could get fired, that I haven't even heard this much, but Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Dirk Kotter, I mean, they were on Hard Knocks, which only just sort of highlighted this is a team that's got talent. This is a team that's got Gerald McCoy and Jameis Winston. This is a team that's got Mike Evans and now Deshaun Jackson. This is a team that's got Doug Martin. This is a team that's got Levante David. They drafted Justin Evans. They've got Vernon Hargraves, and they've got plenty of good players, but they are pretty awful. 4-9. They've lost their last 3. They've lost, they started 2-1, so they've lost most of their, recent games. And defensively, just maybe they're last in passing yards allowed, second to last in total yards allowed, 31st in net yards per pass attempt allowed. I mean, they're averaging 8 yards per attempt allowed by opposing quarterbacks. 8 yards per attempt is something that not even Russell Wilson is doing this season. and that's what they're just giving up on average to the quarterbacks that they're facing. And they even drafted Justin Evans last year. They drafted Vernon Hargreaves. So they've been putting money and draft picks into having a good pass defense, and it's just terrible. As far as Dirk Cotter and the Bucs go for next year's draft, what do you think they have to focus on, and would you focus on it with Dirk Cotter?
No, I think there's going to be a change there. It seems to be trending that way. It looks like there's going to be a lot of job changes in 3 weeks' time. I think Bill O'Brien was the latest to be linked with losing his job this week or today. So I think that Dirk Cutter's going to go. I have no idea what they're going to do next. There's even some talk that maybe John Gruden ends up back in Tampa Bay. What do they need? I guess you could suggest that running back is a potential need for them. Doug Martin is a bit hit and miss, and they've not really had some consistency there. On defense, I think I gave them a defensive lineman. I think that's another thing. Gerald McCoy's been great for years, and will always be disruptive. But can you put somebody next to him who can offer you a little bit more maybe than Clinton McDonald now? And I think someone like Christian Wilkins, for example, at Clemson, who plays a little bit like Sheldon Richardson, maybe a slightly more compact player, more compact frame, maybe not quite as good a pass rusher, but gets around the field, non-stop motor, really, really relentless work ethic. I just think that someone like that would be a perfect complement to someone like Gerald McCoy.
In finishing into number 9, the New York Jets right now would be the next team up, and they're also, like the Colts, maybe a bit of a surprising team, even though they're a bad team, 5-8. That being said, they were 3-2, so they've lost some games here and there, and they just got shut out by the Denver Broncos, which Denver's defense had really fallen apart. Josh McCown seems like a guy that they want to bring back. They've said that they want to bring him back, even though he's going to be 39 years old, if you can believe that. Josh McCown still plugging away, 18 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. There's a lot of ways that the Jets could go, right now it seems like, and it doesn't seem like they're going to go quarterback, at least not early. By the way, Jeremy Bates is the quarterback's coach for the Jets. Jeremy Bates, of course, the Seahawks offensive coordinator in 2010 that got replaced by Darrell Bevell in 2011. So take note of that. As far as the Jets go right there, that seems like they'll be sticking with their plan, kind of, not do a total rebuild. What do you think of the Jets in the draft next year?
Well, I've seen suggestions that they might be really interested in Josh Allen. I think Tony Pauline was done a piece today saying that he thinks that Josh Allen could be targeted by the Jets. That would make some sense. They did sort of start to prepare to blow things up at the end of last season, and it did kind of feel that that's the way it was going to go. And yet they've been a lot more competitive than people think, and that's kind of put them in a position where they're not going to get it someone like Josh Rosen or Sam Darnold if they declare, maybe not even Baker Mayfield without trading up. So you kind of wonder what they're going to do, because I would imagine that McCown would probably come back unless he's planning on retiring. Watching his emotional press conference today or yesterday, whenever it was, it's hard to get a read as to whether that was him sort of saying goodbye or saying it's time to go, or whether he was sort of really hoping that he will be back next year. So we'll see what happens there. I do think they will draft somebody to maybe sit behind someone like McCown. And I think this would be a good spot for it if they can get it at Josh Allen. But I gave them Connor Williams because if they're not going to get at the quarterback, so if they just think, you know what, that option's not there right now, for whatever reason, then improving their offensive line would be a huge need.
Cincinnati Bengals lose this week 33-7 to the Chicago Bears. They are 5-8. Marvin Lewis remains a head coach who has been there since 2003. 0 playoff wins, headed towards an even worse season than the last season, which was their worst season since 2010. Another top pick, it seems like. Can't run the football, even though they have spent draft picks on Joe Mixon, Giovanni Bernard, Jeremy Hill. I mean, no teams tend to spend second-round picks on running backs, and they keep doing it, and they're still the worst running team, it seems like. And I don't know what the hope is. How one. So the thing is, I don't see how anything that the Bengals do in next year's draft. I mean, they drafted John Ross 9th overall, and he caught 0 passes as a rookie. And then there was even rumblings that they were like, maybe he should be a defensive back. I mean, your 9th overall pick is a guy that you don't even think was – that you would question whether or not he was even playing on the right side of the field, which, is something that Pete Carroll may do every year with offensive/defensive linemen. But the 9th overall pick in this draft, John Ross, zero contributions to the team, 1 12-yard run that he had, and shut down for the year. So in terms of the Bengals, it just seems like I don't see how they could do one thing. It seems just shut it down and try again if it's me. But with you, Rob, what are your thoughts on the Bengals and what they would do with the top 10 pick next year?
Well, a Bengals fan, this is what I love about mock drafts, was quick to tell me that my mock draft was wrong, that the Bengals wouldn't take a defensive lineman. He had some good points there. I don't think defensive end, in hindsight, I've not studied the Bengals. I've not seen a lot of them this year. With hindsight, that wasn't the way to go. I gave them Clellan Ferrell in the draft, more thinking that that's the type of player that they've taken in the past, rather than thinking this is the huge need for them. I think offensive line is the big thing for them. If they get a chance, if they're picking the top 10, Quentin Nelson at guard would make a lot of sense. And if he's already gone, someone like Billy Price would also make sense. Then you look at the tackles as well, Mike McGlinchey and Connor Williams that I've talked about there with Texas. They're sort of the 4 that you would imagine the Bengals targeting if they do pick in the top 10.
And let's we can skip ahead maybe to some of the other NFC West teams. We talked about the San Francisco 49ers, but in regards to the Arizona Cardinals as well, right now, it looks like their draft position is 13th, and I don't know if that'll change based on Miami's win, because Miami is 5-7, Arizona is 6-7 if they win. But middle of the first round, maybe edging towards the top 10 again. But the Arizona Cardinals have, they just beat the Tennessee Titans 12-7. They beat the Jaguars 2 weeks ago, so they've beaten 2 teams that the Seahawks lost to this year. Though both of those games were at home for Arizona, as opposed to both those games being on the road for Seattle. Still, they've shown that this is not that even in their worst season, under Bruce Arians, they're still a part of the Arizona Cardinals that's very talented. They just don't have the quarterback situation figured out, and they've been ignoring it and not addressing it in the right ways for a couple of years now. And they don't have, the running back situation really situated, and they've been running out Adrian Peterson out there. But there's certainly pieces in place. So with the Arizona Cardinals, we also don't know the future of Bruce Arians, whether that's going to be his decision or the franchise's decision or whatever is going to happen there. But as far as the Cardinals do you see there being a place or a piece or things that they can do very simply to get back into that 12-win range for next season? And what would it be in terms of the draft?
No, I don't. I think that ship has sailed. They had they're really talented defense. They had Carson Palmer playing at a really high level. If they obviously get David Johnson back and can get some effective quarterback play, then there will be a really tough out. But I think that the days of them looking like a real threat in the NFC and maybe even being the favourites to go to the Super Bowl from the conference are gone. I think that they've got to a point now where Bruce Arians has been talking about drafting a future at quarterback pretty much ever since he came to Arizona, and I think it kind of has been a target of theirs, but for whatever reason they've not either been in position to take the quarterback that they want, or they've just seen a more different. Last year they took Hassan Reddick, but they were just outside the range of taking someone like Deshaun Watson, for example, or Patrick Mahomes, and didn't go with that and took the linebacker instead. So I think that they have to take a quarterback, someone that they can bring in and develop. I think that's why Arians may well stay around next year, is just to have that sort of early experience of working with the young quarterback. I think the team will want him to do that, and we'll see what they do, because if they're picking this range, they're probably not going to be able to get at the top 2 or 3. Are they going to trade up and be really aggressive to get that future at quarterback? We saw a lot of teams doing that. Houston traded up last year. We saw Kansas City trade up last year. We saw Chicago move up 1 spot to get Mitch Trubisky. Teams were really, really aggressive to go and get quarterbacks. So there's a chance, I think, that Arizona will be the next team to do that, and next year make that bold move to go and get the guy that they want to build around.
You know what else would be interesting with the Arizona Cardinals next year? Is the injury to David Johnson, is the injury to Carson Palmer, is the injury to Marcus Golden, another guy that was very productive last year that didn't play this year, save for 4 games. Then they've also, they'll see if they get any, further progress from Tyrann Mathieu, who's been quieter this year than most years in terms of at least the way how much we talk about him. And then there's Budda Baker, who had some great games at safety and is starting to work himself in there. And Hassan Reddick, we haven't seen much, but we talked about him a lot last year in the podcast. Patrick Peterson's only 27 years old. And I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on some of the guys they'll be getting back. Do you have any thoughts on Budda Baker, Hassan Reddick, and Robert Nkemdiche, who is a guy that was talked about a lot in the last couple of years and on this podcast in terms of the draft with Robert Nkemdiche? I would say for the most part, he seems like, I don't want to call him a lost cause, but there isn't anything really to pin yourself in terms of why you'd be hopeful for Robert Nkemdiche. How do you feel about some of the young guys in Arizona?
I've not seen them enough to really sort of know how they've played. I know that Budda Baker had that fantastic game not so long. I think it was his first start actually, and I think he sort of had a perfect score according to PFF. Take that for what it's worth, but yeah, he seems to have a really big game there. I've seen Reddick when they played the Seahawks and in another occasion as well, and I have to say, I thought he would provide more impact than he has, and they needed something from that because they've had a few injuries there. When Marcus Golden went down as well, I thought, okay, this is the time we're going to see Hassan Reddick really step to the fore. I think obviously looked like a fantastic player in college. Maybe he's going to take a year before really coming on strong. But I kind of expected him to be a possible candidate for Defensive Rookie of the Year, and seems to. Maybe he's having a great year, and I just haven't seen him enough. But it just seems to have had a quiet opening season. And that's with Nkemdiche. I'm really not sure. Not seen him play much at all. But I will say this: that Arizona have, for whatever reason, made a huge gaffe letting Calais Campbell leave that team. They should have done whatever it took to guarantee that he would finish his career in Arizona, and they are paying the price for that big time.
Finally, and it's a great way for us to transition into the final talk of the show, but it's the LA Rams. They're 9-4. They they're football outsiders. Certainly projected them going into the year as being a team that would be great. And they're second in scoring, 8th in yards, 3rd in net yards per pass attempt, a decent rushing team. I'm not going to say great. Obviously, Todd Gurley is going to go to the Pro Bowl, and he's got 1,600 total yards and 13 touchdowns, and he hasn't fumbled, I think, in the last month or two, which is a positive for him because he was fumbling all the time. Just ask, Earl Thomas about that, but they've got some good stuff going there on offense and defensively. I think they rank in the top 5 on Football Outsiders, 8th in net yards per pass attempt, but though the rushing 30th in yards per carry allowed, not as super tight as you might expect, but a pass rating allowed of 79.3. They could probably load up on that run defense a little bit, but they are going to Seattle this week, and the winner of that game will be first place in the NFC West with 2 games to go, and Seattle will have swept them if they get the win. And I believe, I heard this, so don't pin it on me exactly, and I heard this a week ago, which is that no matter what, even if the Rams win this game, if they finish with the same record, the Seahawks will win the West. But that being said, I guess if they win this game, they'll be 2 games up with 2 games to go. So if that were true, it wouldn't lock it in for the Rams. They would virtually lock it in if they just win one of the last 2 or Seattle loses one of the last 2, which is all inconsequential. I'm not just rambling, but in terms of the Rams, 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions by Jared Goff. They're going to stick with Sean McVay and Jared Goff, I assume, moving forward next season. What do you think in terms of the Rams? How real their 9-4 record is, the progress of Jared Goff, and what do you think? Because now they're going to be in the position that they're not usually in, which is picking at the end of the first round as opposed to the top of the first round. They should be picking somewhere in the 20s instead of the top 5. What's going to be the thing for the Rams later in the first round that they're going to need the most help in moving forward, and that would give you the most pause moving forward if they got a guy like blank?
I think a defensive playmaker in the back end, whether it's another linebacker or a defensive back, would be the main cause for concern there. Because I think on offense they're pretty much rolling. You know, they're getting production out of the receivers. They've got a very good running back. They've got the quarterback that they're going to go with now. I mean, I'm still not completely convinced about him. Offensive line's working well. Andrew Wyth might miss a game at the weekend, but you know, he's had a very good year, and you would expect him back next year, whatever this injury is. I think it's really sort of that, you know, continuing to improve the defense, because what I think we've seen from the Rams this year, and I'm probably more optimistic about this game than I was the last two for the Seahawks, is that when they are able to, for example, when they play a bad team, when sort of everything's expected of them, that they can just go out there, do what they want to do, and execute, and everything's fine, then they're very, very effective at getting the job done very early. So if they're playing a bad team, for example, it's not been unknown this year for the Rams to be sort of like 14 points up at the end of the first quarter, and then at halftime the game's already gone away from the opponent. You know, it's like 27-0 or something, or 27-3 or something like that, and the Rams have just ridden off into the distance with the game. But when they've played teams who are difficult, who maybe knock them out of their comfort zone, where that take away these sort of easy throws that they've been giving Goff. You know, Goff he likes to sort of, this year he's been helped so much. He's almost been mollycoddled by Sean McVay to give him as many easy option throws as he can have. And he hasn't been asked to do a great deal in terms of challenging a defense. And when we watched him against Seattle, I mean, he had a couple of turnovers, didn't he? He had 2 or 3 turnovers, but it could have been like 5 or 6 on the day. Threw a lot of passes that could easily have been intercepted and did not look convincing. And then you see the same thing in Minnesota. You see a little bit of that against Philadelphia yesterday. And when he's played the good teams like those sides, and the Redskins at home when they lost that game, I think there are things there that maybe you think, well, maybe this team will get worked out over time. And I don't know. I just think that going to Seattle, with the game being in Seattle and with it being a must win, and even if Seattle are missing another key player, it looks like Bobby Wagner, a game time decision. I think Pete Carroll's called him today. KJ Wright, they're a bit more optimistic that he's going to be okay, so hopefully he'll be there. I just get a feeling that this is a game for the Seahawks, and the game that concerns me most out of Seattle's remaining schedule is the Dallas game on Christmas Eve, because I think that the Seahawks may well need to win out, because Rams, even if the Seahawks win this game, they would just be level with the Rams. They won't have they really need to win one of these games they've lost so that they could be level now, looking to go ahead with the tiebreaker. That needed to be what they were sort of going for there. The Rams only play, I think it's the Titans?
At Titans hosting the 49ers.
Exactly. You would expect them to win both those games if needed. And it's that Dallas game on Christmas Eve that concerns me, because that's the type of game. Dallas have sort of picked themselves up off the floor recently. That's the type of game that the Seahawks just haven't been winning recently.
So, yeah, I mean, we know going into this Rams game that the Seahawks will have Sheldon Richardson and have Michael Bennett and have, Quentin Jefferson, no suspensions for those players based at the end of what happened at the end of the Jaguars game. We don't know if they'll have Bobby Wagner or KJ Wright. My gut feeling, and this is just a feeling, is, Wagner will be ruled out on Friday, and Wright, it'll go up to game day and until the inactives are maybe given out. That's just an instinct, and who's to say whether or not he'll play or not, but that just seems like the way that things are going. That, Deion Jordan returned to practice. I think is returning to practice on Wednesday. We'll see about Naz Jones. There's other players that could be getting back. Deshaun Shedd has been practicing. So there's some hope for maybe some reinforcements, and they won't be suspending those players. But going up against the Rams, you're going to need as much as you can get. And then there's still the fact that the Seahawks have won 11 of the last 12 against the Rams at home. This is a different Rams team than we've seen before, and a different Seahawks team. But, I think that home field advantage is good. I think if there's a mental advantage that the Seahawks have it, and, that the Rams are in their first position here. All of the players on this team, pretty much for the most part, on the LA Rams are in the position for the first time of being the team that's supposed to win, being the team that is expected to win, being the team that's expected to win the division, being the team that's got momentum going into it. And will they be able to hold tight onto that? Will be interesting to watch. Either way, Seahawks and Rams, like you're saying, even if the Seahawks win this week, they've still got to beat Dallas in Dallas. They've still got to beat Arizona, which we were talking about earlier, the fact that they've got a talented team, and the Cardinals have beaten the Seahawks in Seattle in crucial games before. So there is only light at the end of the tunnel, not just through beating the Rams, but by, probably winning out and hoping that the Rams lose to Tennessee in Tennessee probably, or that Jimmy Garoppolo just is the real legit deal in the final week of the game, final week of the season. I don't know what to expect in the Rams game because we don't really know exactly all the players that'll be there. I think Bobby Wagner is super important and critical for sure. And I don't know exactly what the long-term future of the Rams will be. And if we were to finish this up, Rob, Sean McVay, I think he's so young, but he seems to have it all together. Instant success with a franchise that hadn't had success since in over a decade. All those years with Jeff Fisher, all the years in between then and now with Linehan and Spagnuolo, where they would lose 14 games. Sean McVay, how impressed are you right now with what he's been able to do with Jared Goff in this offense and this defense? And I guess, the other thing that they have to address after the season is over is a potential $110 million deal with Aaron Donald. What are your thoughts on the Rams' hope and future with Sean McVay and potentially Aaron Donald?
Yeah, well, I think he's been very impressive, McVay, and has managed the situation very well. It's a promising start. I do think the teams will find out this way that they're managing Jared Goff, and eventually they're going to have to hope that he develops and can do a little more with the offense. So very, very encouraging. You can't help but be impressed with what they've done so far, and they're going to be a pain in the arse for the Seahawks over the next few years. I'm sure about that. And the Seahawks have got to get back on top of their game, not just this week, but for next year and the following years as well, because they're not going to go anywhere. They're a young team. Aaron Donald is legitimately one of the top 5 players in the league. I think that it's ridiculous that they haven't just paid him by now. I mean, if there was ever a player to pay, it's Aaron Donald. It's just such a disruptive player, such a fantastic talent. You don't hear any bad, negative stories about him either. Rarely ever has an injury of any kind. So I'm shocked that I sincerely hope that they find a way to mess this up and let him leave and go and play in the AFC or something, or even in Seattle, because I just can't believe that they haven't sorted this out by now. But I think that they will, and I'm very impressed with them. And the thing that they've got that maybe the Seahawks haven't got right now is they know who they are, and they know the direction they're going to go, and they know what their trajectory is and sort of the plan that they've got. And the thing that it kind of feels the Seahawks right now, is I've just written a piece about this, is what are the Seahawks? They came into the season wanting to run the ball to get back to that. That hasn't happened. They've now become very Russell Wilson centric. When the off season comes, are they going to go even more to that way? Are they just going to accept defeat and the whole, we want to be back to the 2013, 2014 Seahawks? Are they going to become more the Russell Wilson Seahawks and sort of build around that? Does that mean more investment in the offense going forward now, and maybe sort of regressing the paying on the defense, because the defensive pay has always been a lot higher than the offense? Are they going to maybe make some tweaks and try and freshen up the roster? Are they going to move on for some older players and make some painful cuts or some trades to try and just give this team a bit of a boost in the lift? Maybe not in terms of talent necessarily, but just in terms of freshness and vigor. And you look at upstart teams like the Rams and the Jaguars and the Saints and the Vikings and stuff like that are playing with almost like they've got a point to prove. And the Seahawks have become a team where teams prove a point against them. And that was what we saw on Sunday. The Jaguars were desperate to beat the Seahawks, to say, we can beat this. This team has been in the Super Bowl. They blew out the Broncos in that Super Bowl 43-8. We were going to beat this team. That's going to prove how good we are. And that used to be the Seahawks. That they were the team that were going out those games to prove to everybody else how good they were. And now teams use them as a statement game. And it kind of feels like, I don't know if the Seahawks can get back to where they were. Maybe they're just they're just too good with this coach and this quarterback and this team and this defense to ever get back that sort of chip on the shoulder. But maybe they just need to bring the star names down a little bit, build around a younger core of, Wilson, Wagner, and Earl, for example, and sort of churn a little bit and do what the Patriots do, which is constantly churn the roster, but just keep several key players. They've not got rid of Brady, obviously. They've not got rid of Gronk. They've kept Hightower, but then a lot of other guys have moved on. Sometimes when you didn't expect it, and they've got high picks for them, or they've moved things around, and maybe that's something the Seahawks have to consider. So that is the one thing I'm jealous of, really. The Rams kind of seem to be on a pathway now, which is a straight road ahead, and they're going to continue walking down it. Whereas the Seahawks, for me, there's kind of like several forks in the road, and we're going to find out in the off season, what kind of direction they're going to go in and where the future of this roster is. And I think it's going to be very interesting and fascinating, and maybe even sometimes painful off season for the Seahawks. But that may be needed if they're going to stay on the top.
And lastly, Rob, just hitting up that, rounding out the Seahawks, and if there was something to think about for next year, and how they move forward to be a better team in 2018 based on their draft. Right now they're right on that. They're like right on that edge of the teams picking in the playoffs and the ones that are not. Right now they're looking outside of the playoffs. So in that 20 range of the first round next year, what sort of, do you see any players that could fall outside of the top 15 that'll be undervalued in some way, that are like, yeah, I think this guy might go in the 20s or in the late teens, but he's just fantastic. There's guys like, Earl Thomas went 14th overall, which isn't too far off. Derwin James, you have here going number 16, a safety, and the future of Cam Chancellor somewhat in question right now. And certainly that could be something that they're looking at, even if they do re-sign Bradley McDougald as insurance or just as straight up a starter for next season. Do you see any players that could be going in that late teens? Now that the Seahawks could be picking a little bit higher than normal, we'll see if they do, but do you see any players in that 15 to 22 range that are being undervalued that may be able to slip by? Or if the Seahawks were to trade up a couple slots, get a guy, do you like a Derwin James or anything like that?
Well, I like Derwin James. I think the point that I made was that he's such a big name player, but he is essentially a strong safety, and I don't think his movement in the open field is, he was kind of billed as this do-it-all safety who could play anywhere, and I think he's pretty much a strong safety. And for me, he's more Eric Reid than Eric Berry. That was the way I was looking at him. That Eric Reid was like the 18th overall pick, and Berry was the number 5 overall pick. And I think Derwin James's stock is more sort of where Eric Reid's was. For me, I wouldn't want him to do that. I mean, unless Derwin James is a fantastic combine or whatever, and you can get some hype going there. I just feel like Bradley McDougald's done so well in place of Cam Chancellor. If they could get him back next year on a relatively cheap contract, or maybe even do 2 or 3 years with him, I think that's a move that I'd like to see. I think that McDougald's done a really good job there, and I think that he's somebody who is helping the Seahawks become a bit different. There is going to be a churn. There's going to be some changes, and this is a guy that they've actually been able to bring in, who's fit in, who has got the character and the skills and the fit, and just seems to belong in Seattle. So I'd like to see them sign McDougald. I think the other players, as the Seahawks, as you say, are moving forward now. Someone like Billy Price going to last into the late teens. If Roquan Smith somehow lasts as the linebacker from Georgia, is that something that you take there and sort of say, okay, that they wanted young linebackers a year ago and they didn't do anything with that. Just brought in the likes of Garvin and Will Hoyt and people like that. Is Roquan Smith somebody, if he's there in the late teens, that you go, okay, we'll take this guy and he can be the future next to Bobby Wagner? Billy Price, did I mention him? There's one or two others. I mean, if it is going to become the Russell Wilson show, do you then have to consider sort of offensive skill positions? And I'm a huge fan of Anthony Miller, the wide receiver at Memphis, and yeah, he's another smaller receiver. I think there's a bit of Odell Beckham to his game. I really, really do. I just think there are 1 or 2 drops issues in his college career, but just the grittiest play in the draft, the way that he was a walk-on there, and has absolutely made this happen. And it's just the most explosive, fantastic receiver. I would think that he would be a fantastic pick for the Seahawks, especially if Paul Richardson moves on. And then, you look at some of these running backs, and I really genuinely do believe that Kerryon Johnson, Auburn, and Damian Harris are the second and the third best running backs in this class. Probably, I'd put them ahead of Darius Geis. I'd put them ahead of Nick Chubb, Royce Freeman, Rashad Penny, people like that. I would have them ahead of those guys, and I just think they're just really, really good players. And I don't think the teens is such a ridiculous thing to consider those two players in, because I just think they played so well this year, so incredibly important to their teams. So looking forward to seeing Harris in the playoffs, and I hope that they use him a lot more, because I think he's a much better player than Bo Scarborough. And they're another couple of players that I've talked about a lot this year in the blog that I just have a lot of time for. So I have to say, in a more general point, Kenny, I don't think this is the greatest draft class we're looking at here. I don't think it's loaded with brilliant options, and I think that's probably one of the and the depth won't be as good either. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think the Seahawks will be taking that into account when they were, for example, trading their second and third round pick for Sheldon Richardson and Dwayne Brown, that maybe the talent they were bringing in was vastly superior than the players they could have got in the draft. So I think that's probably something they've considered there. And if the Seahawks end up picking in the top 20, there will be, it might be for the best thing, for example, in sort of the 18 to 22 range might not be such a bad thing this year. I think top 10 picks, the teams in the top 10 are going to want to trade down. If they're not after a quarterback, they're really going to want to trade down. There's not going to be the legitimate sort of 8, 9, 10 players in this draft class that you really, really have to have. That's not going to be there. The value at number 8 is going to be very similar to the value at probably like number 20. So picking in the 15 to 20 range, if that's what happened to the Seahawks and they missed out on the playoffs, wouldn't be the end of the world in that regard. But hopefully the Seahawks will make the playoffs, and they can have a bit of a run there. It's not looking great at the moment, but hopefully they can find a way to get through this run and get to the postseason.
Last thing, for real, last thing, but just important. The Eagles beat the Rams, but lose Carson Wentz to a torn ACL, out for the year. Eagles, do you see their season is over now, even though they'll obviously get not just a playoff spot, but a high playoff spot? Do you see their season as being over? And how tough of a break is this for Carson Wentz moving forward?
Yeah, it's a tough break for a guy who's played really, really well. And, you don't want to see this. There's been so many stupid injuries this year, with really good players getting out, and, it's hurting the league. It's made for, I've found this to be a really unsatisfying season, not just watching the Seahawks, but just watching the NFL in general. I've just not particularly enjoyed it. It's not how the league's always better when the Seahawks, I think, are playing better. And this has just not been I've probably enjoyed this year even less than last year, which was it's kind of saying something. And when it ends, it might be a bit of a relief to move on and talk about off-season stuff. But I in terms of the Eagles, the one thing they've got is, because they're on 11 wins now, aren't they? And they're back in the number 1 seed. So if they were to win 2 more of their games, I'm guessing they're guaranteed a bye, and they do have enough talent to win a couple of regular season games with Nick Foles quarterbacking them. And if they do get the number 1 seed, then they're 2 home games away from the Super Bowl. And if you have to go to Philadelphia and they've just had a bye, they're going to be a tough out, even with Nick Foles as the quarterback. And that's the thing, it's the importance of those byes. You only have to win 2 home games to get to the Super Bowl. So that this happened now and not 6 weeks ago is huge for them. If it happened 6 weeks ago, then yeah, the season's probably over. But the fact that they're this far down the line now, and Nick Foles, I guess, will know the offense. He's been there. Doug Pederson is Andy Reid's old defensive coordinator, so he will know the offense. The offense he was drafted to play in by Philadelphia back in 2012. So I think that they will be more competitive than usually will be the case when Carson Wentz goes down. And the other thing to remember is that this is a year when it's highly possible that the NFC Championship game could be Nick Foles against Case Keenum for a chance to play in the Super Bowl, or Jared Goff, for example, which is just ridiculous, but yet very, very possible this year. So, who thought that was going to happen? So Nick Foles leading a team out of the Super Bowl, yeah. It would be improbable most years, but maybe not this year.
Well, not just that, just the fact that when you bring that up, whether it's the Seahawks or somebody else, if your top two seeds are Nick Foles and Case Keenum, and your division winners are Cam Newton and Jared Goff on the other side. A wild card team absolutely has a great chance to make the Super Bowl in the NFC. And it's that sort of thing where if the NFC lets Dak Prescott, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, Matt Flynn, Matt Ryan into the playoffs, then a division winner may not win the NFC. And we've seen wild card teams make the Super Bowl before, but this is perhaps the best opportunity if you're the Seattle Seahawks to say, if we get into these playoffs as a division winner, it's almost seems much more likely that they'll make it as a division winner than a wild card. But if they make it in either way, because the Saints are 9-4, the Falcons are 8-5, and they beat the Seahawks, they got to beat the Cowboys anyway. Any team that makes it in, so much of the playoffs is about quarterback play. The quarterbacks cream rise to the top. I'm going to rephrase that. The cream of the quarterbacks. Now, creamy quarterbacks get to the top of any sort of playoff situations. It's just so hard to picture. It's so rare that you see teams make the Super Bowl or win the Super Bowl with mediocre to below average quarterbacks. No offense to Case Keenum, but we've got enough of a track record. You have to really believe that the Vikings have a phenomenal defense, like an all-time defense. As good as he's played. If it's Nick Foles, I just don't think the Eagles do have that phenomenal of a defense. So it's going to be opportunity here for someone to make the playoffs as a wild card, to upset these quarterbacks, because when the best quarterback of the division winners, if it's Cam Newton, that's not that great of a quarterback. That's not that great, at least of a passer. It's going to be opportunities there for any one of these lower tiered teams. If Aaron Rodgers gets in at 10-6, if he wins these next 3 games, obviously at that point, the Green Bay Packers are going to be a huge threat going into the playoffs. If the Seahawks can win and get into the playoffs with Russell Wilson, he's looking at being next to Drew Brees as the best quarterback in the NFC playoffs. And that's a huge thing for teams going to the playoffs. Right? Like there are opportunities this year for a wild card. So it's another chance to be hopeful, to just say, if the Seahawks get into the playoffs, they have as good of an opportunity as anyone, right? Right, Rob?
Well, as whether they have as good an opportunity as anyone. I mean, I think the Minnesota Vikings have just looked so great on defense, and Case Keenum actually has played really well. So, I think they would have a better chance than the Seahawks, and I think that the Saints, providing they avoid any fresh injuries to key players, that you would fancy them ahead of the Seahawks as well. Look, I don't think it's necessarily a case of the Seahawks having as good a chance as anybody, but what I do think is that it's a strange year. I mean, it's not that if you were looking at this and it was Aaron Rodgers as the number 1 seed and needing to go through Lambeau Field to get to a Super Bowl, then you would say, oh, game over. He's probably going to do that. Likewise, if Cam Newton had a fantastic year and the Panthers were rolling, or Matt Ryan and the Falcons, a couple of other options as well. You would look at that and think, okay, but it is going to be Case Keenum and Nick Foles and Jared Goff. And the one thing the Seahawks do have is a quarterback who's better than those 3 players. And Russell Wilson, there were 3 people being talked about for the MVP last week. It was Tom Brady, Carson Wentz, who's injured now, and Russell Wilson. So, Wilson on his day, if it becomes a shootout, would have a chance to win a game for the Seahawks. So yes, they can beat anybody. And Wilson could beat anybody, and they could go on the road and win in the playoffs, and they could do all these things. The only problem is that we've also seen the Seahawks have too many games, like they had yesterday against Jacksonville, to believe in any kind of legitimate chance that they've got, because they just can't stay out of their own way. They just have these games where they're, slow starts, too many penalties, bad mistakes on defense, special teams, offense. They'll have a turn at giving up a huge play, for example. And if we'd just only seen 1 or 2 of those instead of 3 or 4, then maybe I could sort of really believe in this, plus all the injuries that have stacked up. But yes, if they get to the playoffs, you just never know. Nobody really saw the Giants when they were 9-7 winning the Super Bowl. Who saw Eli Manning and the Giants beating Tom Brady twice in Super Bowls to win it? you've got to be there to have an opportunity. And right now, I'm just thinking if the Seahawks could just win the NFC West, then at the very least they get a playoff home game and they give themselves an opportunity. And that's all my expectations are right now. But the problem is that it's not so much this Rams game. It's maybe the need to win all three. It would help a lot more if the Rams are playing a really tough opponent like the Patriots or something in one of their other two games after the Seahawks, to think that there's a chance that they might lose 2 of 3. But because I think they're going to win 2 of 3, the Seahawks are probably going to have to win 3 of 3, and that is a big ask.
Well, there it is. That's this week's episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft with a touch of Seahawks chats there at the end, getting into the NFC playoff races and this weekend's game between the Seahawks and Rams. For more, you can follow Rob Staten on Twitter at Rob Staten, Staton. You can go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com and, of course, FieldGoals.com, on Twitter at FieldGoals. And I am Kenneth Arthur. You can figure out a Twitter if you'd like, but don't. And that's it for this week's episode. We'll see how soon it is that the Seahawks lose a game and push us into doing another episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. But certainly we'll have more to talk about in 3 weeks when the first 20 picks of the draft order are set. I'm very excited about the Browns having a couple of high draft picks, so we'll see how that goes. And I'm even more excited to see the 49ers continue to slide down and out of range, perhaps, of the most valuable picks that'll be available. This has been an episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Come back next time for a brand new draft.